Welcome to another edition of WorldView, and we have with us today Dhruva Jaishankar, a fellow with Brookings India, and we are going to take a look at the India-US relationship, especially in the context of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's upcoming visit to the US, both to attend the UN General Assembly and to meet with President Donald Trump. So, the first thing that comes to mind is Kashmir. Do you think this is going to be hanging over Prime Minister Modi's visit, or do you think it's over after what President Trump said recently?
Well, obviously, it's still in the news in India. The implications of the changes made to Article 370 and the states reorganization is obviously still an issue domestically. And for that reason, of course, it's still gaining some traction in the media, particularly in the West, including in the US. On the one hand, I think it has refocused attention in Washington to the Kashmir issue and on India-Pakistan relations after almost 2 decades of India making concerted efforts at trying to diversify in some ways the portfolio of issues that the US cared about in the US-India relationship. At the same time, I think there is now also a conscious recognition on the part of senior US officials, including those around Trump, that obviously there are Indian sensitivities at play, that India is averse to mediation by a third party in India-Pakistan issues. So I think that is quite clear. So I think beyond a point, it will, I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if Trump were to raise either in an interview or in a tweet or something about Kashmir again in the future. But that being said, I think there are limitations as well.
You were mentioning that you were in Washington recently. And did you pick up any signs that possibly India and Pakistan are going to be hyphenated again? Or Kashmir could be linked to what's happening in Afghanistan?
I think there is, obviously, Afghanistan is a very big priority. And I think the Trump administration is very clear that they want to announce some end to the conflict there, whatever that might mean in practice and on the ground. And that will obviously have implications for Indian and Indian security. That being said, I think dehyphenation is, I think, sometimes a confused term. It's not that India and Pakistan or India-Pakistan issues will be completely off the table. But I do think there is a continuing realization that Pakistan must be treated on its own terms and India must be treated on its own terms. And I think you see that in just recently in the completely different set of issues beyond Kashmir that were discussed on the one hand when Imran Khan went to Washington, and on the other hand when Prime Minister Modi met with President Trump in France recently.
The India-US relationship, over the last few years, especially under Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, has been pretty robust, especially when you look at, issues like defense, security, counterterrorism, Indo-Pacific. But there have been some niggling issues on trade. Do you think, what are the opportunities and the challenges when the two leaders meet?
So I would say that there are 3-4 issues that have been quite significant problems in the relationship. I think they still pale in comparison to the problems the US is having with other countries, China, Europe, and others. They're relatively minor, but I think they are very important nonetheless. One, as you mentioned rightly, is trade issues. So it's quite clear now that the US is intending on suspending GSP benefits. These are low tariff benefits for certain items of goods, about $5 billion of Indian exports to the US. India has retaliated. I think there's now efforts underway to mitigate the damage and see, can some kind of agreement be reached. One of the issues that Trump is very focused on and his team is decreasing trade deficits. And India is not in the top 10, but it's not near the top, nowhere comparable to China, but it's on the hit list, if you will, for Trump's trade negotiators. So that, I think, is one issue. India has been trying to point out that the trade deficit has actually shrunk in the last few years, and that India is actually buying more, whether it's energy, defense, civil aviation, and other sectors where agricultural products. So India is actually making a concerted effort at trying to mitigate this issue, unlike certain other countries.
Do you think Trump is actually the uncertain factor? I mean, the fact that he's a transactional president who doesn't, think twice about disrupting, systems that have existed for decades.
I've pointed out that I think we need to distinguish, not just India, but other countries as well, need to distinguish between Trumpism and Trumpisms.
Okay.
And Trumpism is basically the instincts that he feels are, not just he believes, but he feels resonate with his political base. That's a skepticism of multilateralism. So we see this in the abrogation of the Iran nuclear deal or the Paris Climate Treaty. It's on trade deficits, narrowing trade deficits, and getting more favorable trade terms for the US. Sort of skepticism of immigration is another issue, and burden sharing. And he's mentioned this for India, at least in the context of Afghanistan. That this is more applicable to NATO and other countries. So that is, I think, these are indicative of Trumpism, of his worldview, at least when it comes to foreign policy. This should be distinguished, I think, a little bit from the Trumpisms that we see on Twitter, and what he says off the cuff in interviews and in other.
It's something that even U.S. officials say you shouldn't take too seriously.
Yeah, which is that's based on something he saw on Fox News or something that's on the top of his head. And there's sometimes a tendency, I think, in the media to inflate those issues.
Sure.
And we saw this again when he, to some degree, when he spoke about Kashmir with Imran Khan.
One, final quick takeaway. What do you think is going to be the biggest thing that comes out of this meeting? And, where do you think they'll possibly be able to, forge new ground and maybe make some headway?
Well, I think on the one hand, Trump is entering into an election season. Modi's come off an election victory, so I think to some degree the political calendars will be a factor.
Mm-hmm.
But broadly, I think it is about mitigating the areas of difference. Trade, Iran, Afghanistan would be, I think, some of the issues that are at the top of the agenda. At the same time, maximizing the positive areas of the relationship, and that includes security cooperation, Indo-Pacific maritime security, counterterrorism, and so forth. So I think that you will have in some ways two sets of issues there that will have to be dealt with.
Dhruv, as always, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and it was great to have you on WorldView. I think we're going to see more of you on the show in the weeks and months to come. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.